Hope you're doing well. This is going to be my weekly outlook for DXY, EURUSD, GBPUSD, USDJPY, gold, and Bitcoin. And let's start right away with the DXY. So as you can see, the DXY has been in consolidation for basically 3 days. This is a really important week because if we go to the daily time frame, we basically see that the dollar index has been pretty much consistently ranging basically from the April till now. As you can see, we didn't move pretty much anywhere, but what is really important here is this particular low that we took right here, because if you're paying attention to the previous low, we having this really, I would say, significant liquidity sweep, whatever you want to call it, and we rallied to the upside basically to take out this high right here. But the recent price action is a little bit different because as you can see, this is a really sharp move. What immediately caught my interest was basically this imbalance in the market right here, and we respectfully basically breaking and slicing through up and down, but eventually we break to the upside. Also, looking at the Forex calendar, I would be expecting that the major volatility or the bigger, higher time frame setup more likely to be happening in the second half of the week. And what I would be expecting, just solely based on the daily time frame, so because we having this high basically was taken out and we having such a significant wick, we can actually mark it right here. So if we go to the lower time frame, we're gonna see it pretty much clearly for some higher time frame setup. So based on the current structure and the entire narrative, what I'm seeing here is I am basically favoring lower prices till we go to this imbalance in the market right here. My major move for the dollar would be any type of either short towards this imbalance, or basically if we coming back to this imbalance in the market in the following days, I would like to see some reversal and potentially pushing price to the upside. I'm not quite a bit sure if we will break easily this particular range, because as you can see, there are a lot of pin bar to the highs, basically a lot of wicks, which to a certain degree showing me some pretty decent selling pressure. Also, if we will check the 4-hour time frame, everything is perfectly aligning to my understanding to pushing price a little bit to the downside. Because if we solely zoom in here, we can see that after sweeping this high, we having 3 consecutive 4-hour candle closure to the downside. So my very best bet would be that in the following days, we will likely going to take this particular low. And because also on a daily, we having the imbalance in the market right here, I would assume that this is basically my very best bet. But again, nothing I say is financial advice, for educational purposes only. What could eventually happen as well is we will start melting, or basically having this kind of really slow and annoying trend to the upside without any kind of pullback. There would be another scenario, or another scenario would be we would wait for the major news and we could stay basically within this particular range until the news release. My very best bet would be Wednesday, Thursday, and the Friday is likely to be the most probable setup when it comes to these scenarios. But also, it wouldn't be a first time that we would see Monday to start really strong and going for one of these highs or the lows, so keep that in mind. Now going to the EURUSD, you can basically kind of revert it. This is actually going to be a really interesting week, because if I am solely looking at this current price action, right, maybe we can look at the weekly looking a little bit weak, I would say. I would prefer a lower prices, however, because this is a weekly time frame, if the price happen to go lower, it's gonna take probably a few weeks, right? Either way, if we're looking for the weekly time frame, we having a very significant high that we failed to close above. This is a really weak, basically bullish price action, so you can think of it, we more likely going to continue lower. But also because we're having a really strong push to the upside and really strong push to the downside, even though I'm still prefer a lower prices, we could have one of those weeks where after a really sharp move to the downside, we will have a little bit of recovery. It could be also one of the scenarios, because if we take this particular low and we will look how the weekly candle close, we having the wick. We did not close basically below this level, which would be really significant for a bullish, for the bearish price action. Also, if we going to the daily time frame, as you can see, we failed 4 days in a row to basically close below this level. This is a really significant piece of price action. So basically my plan for the EURUSD is we will going to take the previous daily high, which is basically the Friday high. And also on the Wednesday high is more likely to be taken out, especially because we having this imbalance in the market. Because if we go to the 4-hour time frame, we basically still respecting the area of this particular wick, which is a really good sign for the bulls, at least temporarily. So we can basically expect this high to be very likely taken. And also I will be looking for the longs towards this high. It's either going to be one of those days, maybe on a Monday, where we will start basically pushing price to the upside at the London Open. But also it could be one of those days where we might gonna fail to having a strong closure basically about these levels, and we could pull back a little bit lower. This would still be a good long setup for me, because I could, based on the previous price action, we actually have this sweep right here and we push price higher. In here we also had this sweep right here, and then we push higher. Obviously this is a 4-hour time frame, so as you can see, eventually even this structure failed. But on the lower time frame, if we go into the 15-minute or even the 5-minute, for intraday setup, there is definitely move to play. But let's say I want to play something a little bit safer. So in here, for this particular scenario, I would like to see a similar piece of price action like we have here. What I would like to see is basically some sweep of the lows and pushing price to the upside. What is also really interesting right here is if I enable one of my indicators, we actually having a significant push to the downside. And then we start to having these basically green candles. So I see that there is definitely some buying pressure, but as you can see, it's still a little bit weak. If I also go to 1-hour time frame, what you can see is that we having a significant volume on this particular low, and we having a strong absorption, which would make sense that we still respecting this area so much. And if we following another attempt to push price higher, we actually got a 2 significant pushes to the downside on this particular level. We having the sweep and then another volume to the upside. Unfortunately, in this case, we did not have any follow through. But what is really interesting about this latest piece of price action is after we having this sweep, we actually having 2, you can say, consecutive volume candle to the upside. So what I will be watching and waiting basically how we gonna react and respond around this level, because if we gonna break it, it could be a pretty decent nice break in the retest and going at least to this level. If we eventually fail, and let's say we would fail really hard, basically breaking this level, I would be expecting that this low is likely to be taken. And again, depending on the context, if the higher time frame, especially 4-hour, if we will basically take some highs around this level and then significantly fail, obviously what I'm gonna be doing, I'm gonna be aiming for this particular low and riding the trend to the downside. But for that being said, I don't have that much expectation so far. Lastly, I would also say if I enable one of my zones, that this is basically my bread and butter, where I like to trade when it comes to the euro. As you can see, actually, most of the times we actually having a pretty decent basically statistical edge when it comes to trading outside of, I call it, danger zone, because as soon as we breaking down, well, it's a little bit troublesome. Most of the time when we overshoot, we coming back to the mean. You can think of some type of mean reversion. And one of the very interesting piece of price action is basically the end of the July, where we overshoot this danger zone and we came back to it. So coming back to the upcoming week, because I'm seeing that all the confluence without the indicator were basically telling me we could have a really strong potential to push price here. Also now seeing that this is perfectly aligning with my zone, I will be eventually looking for some buys towards these highs. Now if we switch from EURUSD to basically GBPUSD, I would basically say the GU is a little bit more bullish in this case. If we check perhaps the daily looks very similar. What I would be again rather interested, and pretty much everything I see is kind of aligning for at least very first few days or next following candles is likely to be to the upside, because we have a very significant imbalance right here that is very likely gonna be tested, because usually what you can see if we having such a volume, it tends to be tested rather well. There was one example, and I believe there was, for instance, another one. And we can definitely find a couple of these. So I'm basically a little bit more bullish, even though everything looks rather bearish. Probably very main reason is seeing how we are responding on such a key level. I don't see enough follow through, so it make a perfect sense that we need to push price higher before we continue lower, if that's going to be the case. When it comes to GU, I actually see this as a very well established range, so as long as we gonna hold this particular high, I am favoring the higher prices to take out these highs and basically these highs right here. In this case, I basically have two type of scenarios. The first one would be that this is going to be my intraday basically establishment, and we will push price from here. So I would like to see some manipulation and lower time frame confirmation, 5-15 minutes, and pushing price higher. If that's not going to be the case, I will take basically this particular range right here as a very important key area, and I basically want to see some setup on a 15-minute time frame right here, and again targeting the highs as always. My very and maybe only scenario for the bearish side would be either if we're gonna start melting down right away and having really strong bearish candle to basically continue to the downside, or eventually taking the highs and having some shift in the market, change of the character, break of structure, whatever you want to call it. These two type of scenarios would be basically the only one when it comes to bearish trades. Now let's go to the USDJPY. Coming to the daily looks actually rather interesting. UJ is going to be actually a really interesting to see, because also we having a pretty significant range so far. But what we actually had recently is we had two taps on these lows. If you noticing that basically on every single time, basically three times we tested this level, and every single time we reverse rather nicely. There were always some really decent setup on basically the weekly time frame. Also, if we're going for internal structure, we also tap twice right here and having some pullback. That basically put me in a scenario where I would be maybe a little bit cautious when it comes to this level, because what can happen right here is we could have a similar price action and having another push to the downside. That could easily happen for a couple of reasons, and I would say probably the main reason is if we looking at this piece of price action that was basically recent, we having such a really strong pushes to the downside, but the momentum to the upside is rather slow. So we having a, let's say, more corrective move. And because we having this correction, I need to see some really strong trend, or basically a really strong candle closure around this level to consider anything bullish right here, because it could be one of those cases where we would basically take the highs right here and pushing price lower, breaking the lows and the lows right here. What I actually like about this price action is because we having the imbalance in the market on this particular push, then we push price higher, then we had another basically intraday sweep right here, and then we continue higher, and then we also had another sweep within this imbalance in the market right here. So you can think of this price is very efficient. So I would like to see and going to the 4-hour time frame, and I would basically say that if we still respecting this level, I would be looking for the buys basically towards the high and also potentially retest this level, because basically the current bullish order flow showing all the signs right here. So this will be probably on my secondary tier list because it probably needs a little bit more candles to showing me what we gonna do right here. If we gonna fail, I'm gonna be shorting towards the lows, which realistically unlikely gonna happen the next week because this is the daily time frame and it will take tremendous purchasing power to push price that low. But you never know, it can happen. But like I said, if I happen to see a strong push to the upside and we happen to continue higher, I am expecting basically a new highs in the following weeks. Going to the daily on the gold is going to be a really interesting, especially because we having the war nowadays. I would assume that we wants to see a little bit higher prices. If I have to bet, and basically, first of all, what I'm seeing here, we basically stuck between these two significant levels. So we could either continue the trend, the bearish trend to the downside, but basically we having 3 consecutive days that we stay within this particular range. What is really interesting right here is we having this imbalance in the market resting about the Wednesday high, and basically assuming the entire narrative in the world, the economics, and basically the daily time frame, we still trending to the upside. It is also possible that we could literally open the Monday and shoots right below, but seeing the daily candle, I would say it's probably less likely. But also, if we're going to the 4-hour time frame, we actually don't have such a strong pushes to the upside besides this kind of establishment right here. So what I will be watching is definitely some piece of price action towards the highs from either momentum based or some pullback to the upside. That's probably the only scenario for me, and if I actually looking at the zones that I like to trade, we actually having a really nice reaction of this danger zone. So also seeing all the other confluence that I personally like to trade, seeing this SR zone with all these internal highs, it kind of giving me very similar vibes like EURUSD. So I would basically betting on a bullish bias towards this week. The question for me will be if we gonna establish some range right here and give me that sweet 15-minute or 5-minute setup on this particular level, or basically right here. Let's go to the last one. So the last one is actually going to be really interesting, and if you guys know my snowflake setup basically from accumulation Wyckoff, this is actually a really decent on a weekly time frame accumulation right here. I actually would be looking for some really strong reaction of this. Again, I am not sure if we're gonna even break this high, but beauty of trading basically this accumulation is it's gonna give you insane risk to reward ratio. So I would be definitely watching the levels right here, because for a swing position or some sort of bounce play, what I like to call basically the price going to the very extreme, gonna bounce, give you 2, 3, sometimes even 5 times risk to reward ratio within a basically like snap of finger, like either a couple of hours or a couple of days depending on the time frame, and it could give me 3 to even 10 times the ratio. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're gonna start to pushing price to the upside. It basically means this was a very significant piece of price action, a really significant consolidation, and it usually having the bounce first before it breaks, if that's going to happen. So basically bounce play here, and seeing how we going to basically close the weekly right now, I would actually assume that we will going for basically the lows. So these two lows, these 2 weekly lows is going to be my main basically draw on liquidity, or whatever you want to call it, but I like to call it key levels. So these 2 key levels gonna be really important for me. The only, or if we talk about the bullish scenario, the bullish scenario in this case only will be if we will gonna respect basically this particular wick right here. So we're not gonna violate the lows right here, and we will having a strong momentum to the upside. If that's going to be happening, I obviously gotta be targeting the highs. but so far the higher time frame is very likely for the bearish side. We'll see how that's going to happen. Also seeing the gold and other currencies in a little bit very similar spot, I would probably assume that the shorts are more likely. Also for our time frame looks rather decent. We had such a really strong bounce of each levels and basically having a really nice opportunity right here. Basically my plan for following days will be, I want to see how we're gonna react within basically this level, because if I make this chart blank again, we having a significant imbalance on this level, which also would be a really, I would say, sweet spot for a really nice basically sweep. So if we happen to coming back here and having this really nice push to the upside and taking some highs with such a strong bearish candle closure, basically one of these candles would be really nice to have in this type of scenario. I would be start to shorting to the downside. Other than that, I don't think there's gonna be any really interesting play for me to watching the BTC now. This is going to be my trading plan for upcoming week, and if you want me to do more of this type of content, leave this video a like and maybe leave some comments so the YouTube will know that this is insightful content for their traders. Anyway, I'll wish you the best luck and see you next time. Take care.